Welcome again to Paul Diamond. We've let him off the hook for a few weeks, but no longer. The Rochdale event has occurred, and there's a lot of legal difficulties here, Paul. It appears the law has been broken. Certainly Richard Tice of Reform thinks it has, because they were standing outside polling stations with leaflets. Islamist comes to mind with all this, and it's clear to some people, certainly to Reform, that these postal votes have proved a nonsense, because the figures have shown that the last postal vote were 14,000, and now with much less people actually voting, it's gone up to 23,000. What's going on, Paul? Can we do anything about it? It appears that somebody's broken the law, perhaps, in this instance.
Going back to our new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, there seems to be a sort of almost coexistence with his premiership, a sort of collapse of confidence in the country and hope. The Rochdale by-election is the shape of things to come. It's the beginning of Britain's Islamist parties, which will be entering into Parliament, as in many parts of the world, and they will be gathering strength, probably half a dozen seats at the next election, going up to 30 seats over the next few years. And they will enter into alliance with the Labour Party, as they do initially, as political practice from Lebanon to France shows. And we will have a sort of Labour Islamist alliance. So there's a couple of sort of obvious things. The first thing was we had our first sort of election that was unrecognisable in many ways, maybe not the first, but the first noticeable one. It wasn't done in the normal, placid British way of sort of you vote and you campaign and you listen to arguments. There was screaming, there was bullying, there was threats, there was postal votes. You do what's ever necessary to win, if you put it that way, and it looked very ugly. You then got a very intelligent rabble-rouser, George Galloway. I don't know if you can say this. I suspect he's a Muslim himself, a convert to Islam. He talks like one. He says all the Muslim phrases. He said the election was for Gaza. You've got this very intelligent, very able, very witty, very dangerous politician now coming forward, he's going to be the new type of leader, the sort of traditional British leader of decency or hesitation or having it on a plate, or accepted norms on a plate, if I could put it that way. That is just going to go as these new breeds come through who are out to win. So it's actually very frightening. And there's always been a strange alliance between the left and Islam. That was shown under the mayoralty of Ken Livingstone in London when President Bush was president. It was almost this revulsion against the Americans. They were right-wing, they were Christian, they were this. And alliances were formed with Islamic leaders who seemed to have nothing in common. One was, I seem to remember, a 72-year-old man who married a 12-year-old girl, and that was deemed totally acceptable to the left. And I've often wondered, why does the left, so progressive, so anti-racist, go in with the extreme Muslim groups? And I think they're very united. They're both authoritarian. They both like the sexual freedom, believe it or not, in Islam and in the left. And they both dislike the Jews. And that is the community that's lost the most out of this will be the Jews. It's absolutely, Britain is now unbelievable what we are now. I mean, chants against the Jews. Jews can't go to theatres. Abuse on the streets. It's disgraceful. And this great nation has got to get its act together, and it's getting frightening now. They go on like this, there will be a civil war. If the authorities just keep stroking Islamists and don't address mass immigration as a matter of urgency, racial identity and cultural identity are your major building blocks of any society. And we're fragmenting. I mean, all the good work of integration, all the good work of bringing people together, integrating people, will collapse in this extreme politics, mass immigration, and woke policies.
There's not a lot of hope in your voice, Paul. Many will agree with you. We're on the edge of society. The public, the British public, are getting angry. It's palpable. But the government and the police and Whitehall seem totally incapable. You look at all the very strange now protestations in London every week. The police dare not do anything. They've got all the laws they need to, Paul, to do something, and they don't. They're frightened, probably with good reason. Yep. They would be overwhelmed.
That's probably it. The police they've made operational decisions. You can shut down British protesters, you can shut down Jewish protesters, but you can't shut down these mass demonstrations. And if you tried, there would be such a fight that it wouldn't be worth it. So they've made a decision to manage the crisis. And I'm sure that's been discussed with ministers, and they've been told black and white, we've lost control in effect. So it is not looking good in Britain, and I'm sure it's not Britain. I'm sure this could be repeated in many European countries, certainly Western European countries, France, Italy, Germany, possibly even Spain now. And there is an urgency now to address it, but the reality of society is democracy is very fragile, democracy is very rare, and governments scared of the people rather than people scared of the government are very rare. And many countries have been led down this road. Many countries, from the Soviet Union to East European countries, they have governments that ignore their people. Doesn't matter how angry they get. They will deploy the police, they will deploy the military, they will continue with their policies. I mean, democracy is sort of an unspoken rule. It's very difficult. It's a chemical compound that's very difficult to produce, allowing people to debate, not beating them up after you've heard their arguments, making a rational decision. These are Christian principles, which, as we know, are dying. And most of the world is the bullies win. The bully at the moment is also the state. And then the compact of democratic government is very nominal now. It means you go to a ballot and you have very limited choice. I mean, we've got the Reform Party kicking off in Britain. Of course, they won't get the breakthrough because they're too small. What they'll do is wound the Conservatives. The Conservatives are on a death wish, clinging on to a prime minister that cannot win, and they've now caused a rupture in their vote. He's so unable to govern, if I could put it that way, and that will let in a huge Labour majority, which will not be able to deal with these issues. Their ideology is too unbalanced and irrational. It's sort of anti-Christian, pro-Muslim. It's crude as that. I mean, it's phrased in terms of sort of old Marxist language, dispossessed groups. I think the Jews ought to be very frightened with these groups coming to power, and there's very likely to be measures against them. I mean, measures against Israel, yes, almost certainly, and recognition of a Palestinian state, which is so ill thought out and it's just going to be another weapon against Israel. They know that, and they're going to arm it. But I think the pressure would be, well, Jews are rather pesky, and they're too clever and too rich, and they like Israel, so they're going to have to be dealt with. And we are entering a very, very dangerous phase. And as I said, George Galloway is going to be the first of many.
Well, isn't it strange that Galloway is boasting that he will have 57 MPs by the end of the year at the real elections? They may be called the Workers' Party, which he's got at the moment. They may be called independents, but he's out to get, not Rishi, he's out to get Sir Keir. He's threatened him.
Yeah, well, I mean, there is a bit of a sort of little ball thrown to the Rishi. I mean, he probably hasn't got enough nous to grab hold of the ball. But there is a sort of rupture in the Labour Party developing with the split between the hard left and the left, which, if he had some intelligence, he could exploit. I don't think he's got the ability to do that, unfortunately. He's going to try and play the traditional card, let's all rally together. Meanwhile, these dark forces are moving very ably. I think also, I mean, it's quite interesting, and I'm just saying this, the impact of the Jews. I mean, there's this war in Gaza, the whole world, it's immediate. I'm going to be blunt. I mean, I'm not saying it's nice, it's a war, and I'm not trying to, but it's whipped up into this frenzy. No other war has this sort of development. There's not, the wars in Sudan aren't on telly every night, which are infinitely worse. And with UN, no one cares about it. It's just the Jews, and they're going to rip countries apart. They're ripping the country apart. We're having by-elections on Gaza. That's the theme. It's not, I want a better bus service and what's happening to my hospital. It's Gaza. It is very spiritual. We are in a very, very difficult phase, and I mean, the only way you can even have any sort of progress on it, is see it as it's textbook Bible prophecy almost, and it's just, I don't know. I suppose we've been here before with Hitler. We've been here before in other periods in our history. But these are always very unsettled periods. I think they're periods where you have God's wrath. So that normally means poverty, violence, and chaos. And it's not a direction we want to go in. But you never seem to be able to stop the godless. They're all utterly convinced on their route. They're all utterly convinced it'll bring utopia, and it doesn't matter how you show them 1,000 times it brought dystopia. They want to walk the path.
Well, it's a pity you can't blame the Archbishop of Canterbury for being so zealot in his behaviour. He's almost one of them.
Does seem that way. I actually met a clergyman just by chance recently, and they get about 27,000 a year in English terms, and it's very difficult for them to live. It's very difficult for them to sort of, the Anglican clergy were saying, do their jobs, because the cost of living crisis, and they've got extremely low incomes. They don't own their home. They actually think they're going to be homeless when their ministry comes to an end and they want to retire. And then they hear the Archbishop of Canterbury has set up £1 billion fund to sort of repatriation. It's such utter twaddle. I mean, you might as well do repatriation for the building of the pyramids. I mean, if you're going to go in for it, let's go in for it. I'm sure even the Brits are entitled for a back pay from somebody. Maybe the Danes can give us a back pay for all the wreckage they did on our East Anglian coast. I mean, and I think a lot of these clergymen were absolutely staggered that they can't heat their homes. They're at that level because they got this very low income in often a very old, creaky home they don't own. And they've been begging for extra funds, and all of a sudden they've been told there are no funds. You got to, do your calling and at the minimum, and then they find out there's a spare billion whacking around, and it's been spent on absolute nonsense, being pushed forward by this infantile politics where everyone's convinced they're victims. And frankly, as far as most people will see, the people claiming to be victims are enjoying a very good life, with us appalling English people.
Oh, let's I don't know, focus in on one point at least in all this tragedy, and that is the fact that we in Britain and Europe are being cruelly treated. We don't get it, we don't see it, but the Indians see it. Because in India, we had a report yesterday, which we did a program on, that they've decided to stop. Of course, the Hindus against the Muslims, been that for many, many years. Pakistan broke up in a way, East and West Pakistan. But the Indians certainly get it. They're saying, no more Sharia law. We're not interested. We're making a local Indian law which circumvents anything that they would like to bring in. So particularly, they want the women put in place under Sharia law. No, you're not going to do that because preeminent law will be Indian local law. They've done it. Overnight, they've done it. We daren't do that. There's at least 15 cities and towns in the north of the United Kingdom that are in effect under Sharia law. We do nothing. We let it happen.
Well, I mean, firstly, there's the unpleasant discordance between woke utopian ideology. Let's pass a law in Parliament. Everybody must be jolly nice to everybody. I mean, that's the kind of level we've reached. I call it the everybody shall be jolly nice to everybody act. And the reality of the world, hard, fast, unpleasant. You've only got your country. That's all you've got, and you've got to look after it because you may have to defend yourself from nasty players in the world. It's a nasty world, and we haven't worked it out. I think we've got to the stage. I think we have to face reality. We've reached tipping point. I'm afraid the speech that Rishi gave outside Downing Street about the threats to democracy and all of this, that was a speech that should have been given in 2004, not in 2024. It should have been given by the then Prime Minister Tony Blair, and we could have possibly got a grip on some of this and enforced British values. I think we now, and I'm not pointing to have any suggestions on this, it needs a lot of more intelligent people than me. I think we've reached tipping point for the same reason why the police can't enforce the law against the crowds. It's out of control. The same reason we've lost many parts of our country in that sense. There are people, we have to live together with people with different values of right and wrong, good and bad, etc. But there's going to have to be a settlement. And, there's very frightening things happening. I mean, if order breaks down, people will want a dictator. I mean, they're not going to muck around. If this chaos continues, I mean, just to maintain order, there's going to have to, when the British ruled the Raj in India, which you referred to, it was an iron fist because they had to keep all the communities at bay. They were sort of at risk of but I think it needs some imaginative thinking. I mean, I hope we haven't reached tipping point, but we're very close to it. And I don't think we are in a way. I mean, I think we've got, it's not 1950s Britain anymore. Cucumber sandwiches with the crust cut off. That'll look very good in the quaint films. that they probably may allow us to watch, but we've got to come up with something new. And I think that's the challenge. And I think there is a real risk of sectarianism and ethnic community violence. It sounds very strange. I remember I was reading about the Evian conference, and we've also got my little themes again, but I remember reading about the Evian conference in France in 1938. And I read this book about it in 1983. And I was reading it. And it was basically a conference where Hitler said, I don't want the Jews. I'm going to do them in. You lot, the world, can have them. I'll boot them out this afternoon. And the whole world said, we don't want the Jews. Do what you want with them. And then Hitler said, thanks, you've given me the green light. And that was the Evian conference. But I was reading about it, and Golda Meir, who became the future prime minister of Israel, was the foreign minister of the Palestinians, because the Jews were Palestinians in those days. And she was the foreign minister of the Palestinians. And she had a private meeting with Chamberlain. And in that meeting with Chamberlain, I think according to this book and stuff that Golda Meir said, she begged Chamberlain to do something to open up some part of the empire, because she said Hitler's going to, do terrible things to the Jews, and they've got to get out. And Chamberlain refused. And she said, why are you refusing? You got land, you know what's going to happen. And he said, if I let Jews into the empire, it will dilute the British racial stock, and it will bring ethnic violence to Britain. And I've often wondered if that was a self-proclaimed curse, if you get my meaning, on the British. Of course, it was a disaster for the Jews, but in 1938, not one doctor was allowed into Britain, so to speak, from Germany. But in 1948 began the Commonwealth settlement policy. No matter what education you had, religion, part of the world you came from, Britain and the empire was open. And it's extraordinary to explain that other than in spiritual terms. And, the thing that frightens me was he said there would be ethnic violence. And I wonder if that's where we're heading, unless we sort of repent as a nation, and work out some new way forward. I know I'm slightly rambling now, but it's at such a state now of chaos. I mean, you look back in sort of 1975 to 80 when Maggie came to power, and her big problem was the trade unions. You almost think, my goodness, I wish we had problems like that now. And you actually think if Maggie was around now, the heck would she do? It'd probably be too much for her. You know what I mean?
It's fascinating, Paul, what you're saying. It's equally fascinating on the ground what is happening.
What we do know is that the policy of immigration has not been managed well, and the scale of it is so large. Now it's about 1.2 million a year settling in Britain. I mean, it's impossible to deal with it economically, infrastructure-wise, and culturally. It sounds a bit, it's going to sound a bit horrid what I'm saying, but there's an unholy alliance between the bankers and the socialists one wants the utopian world where we all love each other, and the other one wants to drive labor costs down. What gets lost in the middle is a sort of, culture, identity, what's worth living for in your life, those kind of values which have no pounds and pence and no strong defenders. I mean, our government is absolutely appalling, and part of the reason of the collapse of the Conservatives is not just Rishi, but I think it is a lot to do with him, by the way. But is, for the years they've been in power, they haven't addressed these issues at all. In fact, they've stoked them.
Well, look, nobody has, in one sense, Paul, because the PR exercise, pro-Palestinian PR exercise, is brilliant. Everybody seems to be supporting them, even the Americans.
It's the media. The church is silent. People who dissent from it are in fear. I mean, it's nasty, and it's all across Europe. It's not just Britain. We talk about it. I mean, Germany must be, suffering. They're producing the very things they say they don't want to produce: extremists, populists, whatever they call them. Marxists. But people are desperate, and they go to the ballot box, and you're going to have a populist or whatever. And then you're going to have a political leadership that says a man can be a woman, and you're a stupid idiot for not thinking that. And people are getting desperate.
Well, desperate, yes. But I mean, you've got a situation on the 7th of October there that everybody said initially it was awful, and it is truly awful. But think of the decade where missiles were flying out of Gaza.
Well,
every day of the week, we've forgotten that.
Well, I always say to myself, imagine if the Jews put bombs on the London Underground. They'd be dealt with in 24 hours. None of this sort of, we've got to give them lots of more money and understand. That's how they've treated the Muslim community. Imagine if 3,000 renegade Jews had gone into the Palestinian Authority and butchered 300 babies, cut their heads off, raped women non-stop, and then shot them in the head while they were still raping them. Imagine the Jews had done that to the Palestinians, and the Palestinians could defend, and they went into Israel because it was the whole world would be saying the Jews deserve it. Do whatever necessary. No country should tolerate this. The Jews have brought it on themselves. I'm trying to reverse the scenario. And you could see the glee. In fact, in England, when the Palestinians actually attacked on October the 7th, I would say there's about 15 minutes of recognition. But the BBC looked very guilty, didn't know what to say. Their beloved Palestinians had acted badly, and they weren't the pinnacles of virtue. They had to sort of soberly record it through gritted teeth. That was my impression, before they went back on. Well, of course they had to do it. What else could they do? Attitude. And then the parties started across London that the Jews had been killed. There were parties all over London. And whatever Israel did, they weren't going to win. They deserved to be killed, or if they defended themselves, you knew the world would go crazy. So,
in a world, Paul, where we've got utopia becoming dystopia, when black becomes white, it's got to be spiritual. A blindness has been cast on the nations.
Well, I think they've always been a blindness on the nations, but I think it is getting it's demonic. And this is not explicable by reason. And the desperate attempts of the Guardian newspaper to put reason on it, as if there's some economic reason why people, and if only you gave them a bit extra plumbing and a bit of extra job opportunity, these psychopaths would suddenly go, ooh, how wonderful, I can now work 9 to 5 and collect the garbage. It's demonic, and they're going to be demonic, and they're going to eat, and they're going to eat, and we have no spiritual protection now. We can't interpret anything in a spiritual way. We can't, I mean, as I said earlier, it's biblical textbook prophecy almost. I can see the worlds against Israel. I can see them all coming together against Israel. I can see them all saying, oh, there's this good strategic place to get Israel. It's called Armageddon. That sounds a really good place, and we'll defeat the Israelis and the Jews at the Armageddon. That sounds a familiar name. I can't quite figure it out where Armageddon comes from, but it's a very strategic battle place. I mean, you can see it. It's like a textbook suicide note. And God is sitting there, as he says, I think, in Psalm 2. The nations rage. The nations think they're so clever, and the Lord laughs. You know.
Paul, it's been absolutely fascinating. We've got to finalise things now, which we will with one last question. And we certainly left the viewers with something to think about. We've discussed the police and, in one sense, the consensual way we have of operating in Britain. On the continent, of course, it's water cannons, take it, we'll sort it out, and it does sort out the riot. We're not willing to go down that. We've become a nation that everybody wants to get here. The illegal immigration is now just the same as last year. So Rishi has utterly failed. They don't want to vote the British nation for Starmer. They can see the cracks coming thick and fast at the moment there. And because we've not got PR in Britain, it's a hopeless situation. Give us a bit of hope before we go.
Well, there's going to be hope because God does not abandon the nations. I would say Britain has a very noble history. Whatever you cut it, no nation's perfect, but it's had a noble history right through from Magna Carta to Parliament to rule of law. It's spread all these wonderful, beautiful ideas through the British Empire. So before everybody starts screaming their heads off, there's a lot of positive in that. I know there was a lot of brutality, but a lot of these, we spread it everywhere. Even with Israel, Britain created Israel, the Balfour Declaration. And you know what? We ought to be proud about that. Instead of being rattling around on Palestinian states, we created it and we stay loyal to our creation and our commitment. So it's a great nation. We stood alone against Hitler. I mean, totally alone. America wasn't with us. There were 3 years it was alone. And I'm sure half the country said we've got a mad prime minister called Churchill who wants to fight them on the beaches. He's utterly insane. We need this moderate leader called Lord Halifax. I'm sure a lot of people were saying that. We need to cut a deal with Hitler. So the Lord won't abandon us, but we've got to find these roads. If we become a worthless people, and you can't do much with the worthless people, if that makes sense. So the British have got to rise up, and I think it is in the Bible. You can't do it in your own strength. You're just going to. It's so depressing at the moment. If you're a man of integrity or woman of integrity, the modern Britain is you'll probably get driven over. You know what I mean? So you have to do it with the Lord, but there is that way out, and we've probably been here before. I'm sure if I was a historian, we've probably been close to places before.
Paul, thank you so much. We'll see you shortly.
Pleasure.